My name is Michelle Chang, Director of Education and Community Partnerships at the Frye Art Museum. I'm happy to welcome all of you today. I would like to begin by acknowledging the land in which we gather is the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Duwamish and Suquamish tribes, who have since time immemorial stewarded the lands and waters of this place we now call Seattle. Please join me in offering gratitude and respect to their elders past and present, as well as future generations for their stewardship. So I'm delighted that all of you could join us today for this curator talk presented in conjunction with the Frye Art Museum's special exhibition, Black Refractions, Highlights from the Studio Museum in Harlem. With works in a variety of mediums by nearly 80 artists dating from the 1920s to the present, Black Refractions presents close to a century of creative achievements by artists of African descent. Organized by the American Federation of Arts and the Studio Museum in Harlem, this landmark exhibition proposes a plurality of narratives of Black artistic production and multiple approaches to understanding the Studio Museum's powerful collection. And now I'd like to introduce Connie H. Choi, who's the Associate Curator of the Permanent Collection at the Studio Museum in Harlem, where she has worked on the exhibitions Black Refractions, Regarding the Figure, and Their Own Harlems. Prior to joining the Studio Museum, Connie was the Assistant Curator of American Art at the Brooklyn Museum. She has a Ph.D. in art history from Columbia University and a master's degree in arts education from Harvard University. So please join me in welcoming Connie.
Hello. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. And I was telling Michelle and Caroline before we started the program, this is actually the last official program I have talking about Black Refractions, as the Frye Art Museum is the last venue. So I am excited to be here with you all today and grateful that you are taking time from perhaps your lunch hour to listen to me talk a bit about this exhibition. Please do ask questions in the Q&A, and I am hoping that even though this is in a virtual format, we can kind of walk through the exhibition. The Frye Art Museum was kind enough to share installed images of the show with me. So I'm going to kind of take you through room by room with different pairings of objects that I found to be really resonant, and also celebrating the work that the whole Frye Art Museum team did, particularly Amanda Donnan, in organizing this exhibition at the venue. So I will start sharing my screen now, and we'll get started. So, let's see. One of the things that I really enjoyed about the installation at the Frye is that this is the first work you see when you walk into the museum, because Glenn Ligon's Give Us a Poem was the first work that you saw when walking into the Studio Museum in Harlem in our former building. For those of you who don't know, the museum is actually closed right now as we have embarked on a major construction project to build our first purpose-built facility. And so this work for over 10 years actually lived in our lobby, and you could see it from the street on 125th Street, which was really special to us just in terms of this idea of building community, right? This idea that even if you weren't physically in the building of the museum, you could still see it from outside, and it kind of blurred the distinction and the boundaries between art and life, the museum and, Harlem, public space and private space. And so this work is really special, and we're glad that it is really the first work that you see when you walk into the exhibition. Glenn Ligon, as many of you know, is a conceptual artist who works kind of across media, but whose work really focuses on an idea of language and thinking through language as a way to expose larger ideas about society. And so this work, Give Us a Poem, was inspired by a speech that Muhammad Ali gave in the 1970s at Harvard University, where a student asked him to give us a poem. And Ali's response was me, we, right? Very short, 4 letters, 2 words, but very profound in this idea of the individual and the collective, this idea that an individual contributes to a collective, but also the tension that exists between an individual and the collective, right? This is thinking of the 1970s, we're in the midst of the Black Power movement, in the midst of this idea of Black nationhood, still struggling with concepts of what it meant to be an African American existing in US society. And so Ali's statement, poem, this 2-word, really beautiful understanding of what language could be and is, really sets the tone for how we thought of the exhibition as a whole, right? This idea that not only are we celebrating the individual artists and artworks in this exhibition, Black Refractions, but we're also thinking about community, about collective, about history, about the institution as a whole, as a way to not only ground our understanding of Black cultural production across almost 100 years, but to think about how artists of African descent have contributed to the larger art world. So this, again, just in thinking about how this one work in specifically contributes to an understanding of the exhibition, I think it's really important to have it as that first work that you see. The first section in the show is founders. And in thinking about this exhibition again, I really wanted it to be something that foregrounded the work of artists in the mid-20th century, because they were the ones who really set the stage for all that became possible in the decades after. These artists, whether or not they were directly involved with the founding of the Studio Museum, were all so important in contributing to an understanding of what it meant to be a Black artist working in the United States at that time. And so their work really resonates with an understanding of again, Black cultural production over these past few decades. And so this section in particular is a way to celebrate them, to think about how their collective work, their collective struggle really allowed us to build a better future for artists of African descent in general. And I love this view. It's such a beautiful view, and thinking again about how Amanda and the Frye team really set the stage for how you experience these works through, these doorways and framing certain works together. And so on the left, you have Romare Bearden, at center, Benny Andrews, and then on the right, Hale Woodruff. So going on to the next slide and thinking again about the contributions of these artists, it's not just the work that they do, the work that they created, the artwork that they produced, but it's also the work that they did within a larger artistic and social realm. And so Benny Andrews, whom you see on the right here, was very involved in thinking about what it meant to be an artist, an activist, a social activist, what it meant to contribute to building a better future for artists in general. And so he was very involved in a lot of different art groups and artist collectives. And so he was one of the co-founders of the Black Emergency Cultural Council, which was founded in the late 1960s as a way to raise awareness about the exclusionary practices that majority, largely white art institutions in New York City exhibited to Black artists. And so this is Benny Andrews protesting the exhibition Contemporary Black Artists in America at the Whitney Museum of American Art in 1971. So a few years after the Studio Museum opened in 1968, but really again, thinking about this moment of the 60s and early 70s in general as this really important moment in the history of the institution, but also in building community for Black artists. So if we go back a few years prior to this particular moment and prior to the opening of the Studio Museum, starting in the early 1960s, artists began to come together, again, as a way to build community, to show support for one another, to create avenues of being able to bounce ideas off of each other and to really think about what it meant to be an artist, a Black artist working in the United States. And so, as we saw earlier with Romare Bearden and Hale Woodruff in that install image from the previous slide, those two artists were two of the co-founders of an early Black artist collective called Spiral, which was formed in 1963. As again, a way to think about community, as a way to meet on a regular basis with other Black artists to support one another, to provide critiques of each other's work, to kind of instill a sense of community in a moment in which everything seemed really fractured. And so on the left here, I'm showing you a cover of their brochure for their first and really only exhibition, which was called First Group Showing Works in Black and White. And these are the two works that you saw in that earlier install image, Bearden and Benny Andrews. And what I really loved about this pairing and how you could see these two works together is this idea that so many of the artists that we have included in this exhibition were New York based, right, oftentimes, but they came from all over the country. And in particular, there's also actually a dense accumulation of artists who came from the South. And for Bearden and Andrews in particular, they never lost that sense of coming from the South. And their works really resonated throughout their practice and over their long careers with that dual identity of Southern roots, Southern heritage, and a very Northern New York in particular sensibility of work. And so on the left here, you see Bearden's The Farmer. Again, just a celebration of Black life, Black culture, but also an unrestrained, a vibrant sense of what it meant to really have your roots in the South, right? So thinking about farmland, thinking about land in general. And Bearden in particular was very good about celebrating, right, that aspect of Black life. And Benny Andrews on the right here, someone who did not shy away from exposing a lot of the societal ills at the time. And then one of the other things that I found so profound about these two works in conversation with each other is this use of collage, both artists becoming very well known for their use of collage, but in very different ways, right? Bearden taking predominantly from mass publications, thinking about, the Black journals and magazines that were coming out at the time. So Ebony and Jet magazines, but also taking from Life magazine. And you see that reflected in his use of collage, particularly how he's utilizing, cutting out different shapes, usually, parts of human bodies as a way to show tones in skin color, as a way to kind of refract our understanding of the human body, and as a way to celebrate that, right? The differences that are available within the body. And then Benny Andrews, similarly, but very differently, utilizing a lot of textiles in his use in collage, right? So taking oftentimes clothing and, bed sheets and curtains and couch cushions as a way to reflect an understanding of the physical, right, of, again, people, individuality. You can imagine that these things were worn and utilized by the people that he took them from. And so there's a way, again, that both of these artists are inserting the personal into these larger societal conversations, so that the viewer can feel a connection to the people that they're depicting, to the message that they're trying to give, in a more direct way, right? There's a way in which they're imbuing their own histories to make a wider statement about what it meant to be a Black person living in the United States at the time. And so I usually talk about the history of the Studio Museum, but I want to just start or speak briefly about it in this moment to provide a little bit of grounding for those of you who aren't familiar. The Studio Museum opened in 1968 in the second floor of this building that you see on the left here. It was a rented loft, and it was founded by a diverse group of artists, philanthropists, art lovers, politicians, really a group of people who came together with an understanding that an organization, an institution needed to be created to celebrate and support the work of artists of African descent. And so you see our founders in this photograph, this beautiful photograph on the right here, which included, again, as I mentioned earlier, artists. And so Betty Blayton Taylor is one of the artists whose work you can see in Black Refractions in a painting that was created in 1968, the year that the museum opened. So there's a lot of ties from the museum's earliest history, from its founding, with this idea that artists were central to the mission and operation of the museum. And that remains so. And you can see that throughout the exhibition, right? We are an artist-centric institution, and we celebrate the work of artists of African descent and predominantly living artists. And I'll speak a little bit about that later on. So moving on to the next section that you'll see, it's a section called abstraction. And I love this pairing of a work by Richard Hunt on the left and a work by Al Loving on the right, because it really shows you the diversity of abstraction in this moment. Abstraction was very important, particularly in the mid 20th century, because even though it was predominant, right, out in the wider art world, if we think about, starting with abstract expressionism in the 1950s and going into minimalism, pop, et cetera, moving into the 1960s and 70s, it was a somewhat contested field for artists of African descent at the time, right? There was a deep conversation that was happening in the 1960s about what abstraction meant for artists of African descent. There was an expectation in society in general that Black artists would be producing works that showed the figure, that were about social realism, right, to reflect their experiences and the experiences of Black people in general. And artists were pushing against that idea, right? This idea that abstraction could speak on a more universal level, the idea that abstraction could be something that operated, right, in a variety of realms, but also that as Black artists, they didn't have to be representational artists, right? That was kind of not a new concept, but it was something that people really struggled with. And so this idea of celebrating abstraction in this moment is really important. And also this juxtaposition of these two works in particular, I love, because you can see, right, that artists were moving in different directions within abstraction itself. And just highlighting those two works in particular, Richard Hunt on the left here with hybrid form number 3, Hunt, predominantly a sculptor working in metal, but someone who has always worked abstractly, but someone who has always incorporated natural forms. So thinking about plant, animal, human forms within his work. And you see that in this sculpture here, a work that starts, right, if we're thinking about the base of the sculpture, starts with this really like hard-edged shape, and then blossoms into something that becomes more organic, right? We can think about like, different antlers, right? Horns that are coming out of this form. And then on the right with Al Loving, Variations on a Six-Sided Object, an artist who was deeply committed to hard-edged geometric abstraction in this kind of mid 1960s moment, who worked abstractly throughout his career, and who investigated the tensions between flatness and spatial illusion, which you can really see here in terms of thinking about this six-sided figure, right? Kind of pushing against the boundaries of the frame, right? Pushing against the boundaries of this Black frame that he's created and kind of bursting out. So thinking about this tension between flatness, right? The two-dimensional object, and what you can imagine is a three-dimensional object with the six-sided form that he's created here. The juxtaposition of these two, I think, is just so beautiful, because even though they're only created from a couple years apart, we really see how artists are investigating different lines of inquiry, right? Really thinking across really broadly about how abstraction could be explored, and taking different viewpoints with it. And so both of these artists too, further expanding their understanding of abstraction. Richard Hunt, well known for creating huge public sculptures, really beautiful public sculptures, and Al Loving then pushing against this hard-edged geometric abstraction and thinking more about materiality and utilizing materials as a way to think through abstraction. The next section in the exhibition is called Framing Blackness, and it's one that thinks through how artists are celebrating, critiquing, analyzing Black life, right? And how Black life has been perceived in society. Artists who are looking deeply at history, but also about their personal histories, about community, about perceptions within both the United States and across the world of people of African descent. And this pairing of a work by Noah Davis with a work by Henry Taylor, I think, shows those kinds of two extremes of the ways in which, African Americans have had to exist in society for a very long time. We have on the left here Noah Davis's Black Wall Street, the title coming from Black Wall Street, which was the Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was a predominantly Black neighborhood that was actually quite wealthy in the early 1900s. Which resulted in a white mob attacking businesses, residences, and people in this neighborhood in 1921. It's actually the 100th anniversary of this happening just earlier this month. And hundreds of people died and thousands of people were injured in what became known as the Tulsa Race Riot or the Tulsa Race Massacre. This tension again that exists between members of society, right? The fact that a predominantly Black community was attacked for having wealth, for having, property. And so Davis here investigating that, not, we're not seeing a reflection of that in particular, but this idea where he's leaving the viewer to come up with their own conclusions, right? To see their own understandings within this painting. He's leaving it a lot up as questions for us, right? It's really kind of, we want to look closer and figure out what's going on in this painting because it's not quite clear, right? Who are all of these figures? What are they doing? We can assume that some of them have been injured, right? Because they're laying on the ground. We can assume that perhaps this blimp in the sky is something that might be, attacking this community, but he leaves it a lot open for us to think through. What are these birds doing in these cages that are so prominent in the foreground of the composition? What are these figures doing just standing around? And so what I love about this work is that he's not providing us easy answers, right? Davis, throughout his practice, was a figurative artist who celebrated Black life, the Black figure, but who never made it easy for us, never gave us a pat answer for what that was, right? Is really asking the viewer to consider the complexity of that. And then on the right here with Henry Taylor, an artist, again, who works predominantly in a figurative manner, and who looks across history and personal histories to think about Black life as a whole. And so here, taking a moment from history, this is Alice Coachman, who was the first African-American female to win a gold medal in the Olympics. And this was in 1948, who was a high jumper. And the title of the painting, How I Got Over, comes from a song that actually Mahalia Jackson sang in advance of, right before Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington. And so we have these two very different understandings of Black life, right? One that is extremely celebratory, an amazing moment in US history with Alice Coachman winning a gold medal. And then another one that is really a shameful part of American history, right? One that forces us to question our own complicity in some of what has happened in the past. The next section in the exhibition is called the Artist in Residence Program. And as I mentioned earlier, the museum has always been an artist-centric institution. And one of its 3 founding initiatives was actually an Artist in Residence program that brings in artists of African descent, emerging artists, into the museum for an 11-month residency where they have a studio space. They are part of a cohort of artists, and they have access to the museum as a whole, right, to the galleries, but also to the people, to the staff at the museum, to be able to be in conversation with not only curators, but also educators and people in public programs and communications, et cetera. And so at the end of their 11-month residency, they have a group exhibition together at the museum. And so this has been a part of the institution's history from its founding. We are very lucky and proud to have had well over 100 artists come through our residence program, including many of the artists that you see here. So this section really celebrates that program and celebrates the life of that program. So you'll have at least one work from every decade of the institution's life and the program's life. And I have just another pairing for you here, thinking about Maren Hassinger's River. Maren Hassinger was an artist in residence in the 1980s. This work was not created during her residency, but it is evocative, representative of the work that she did make during that time. Hassinger, an artist who really utilizes both natural and man-made materials. So thinking about the juxtaposition of the chain and rope in this case, the tension that creates, to think through how human life interacts with nature, right? How our presence impacts our environment around us. And so this work I find to be so beautiful, but also so emotional, because we think about a river, right, which is what the work is named for, but we also think about the Middle Passage, right, and how hundreds, millions of Africans were brought over forcibly to the Americas and elsewhere to be enslaved for centuries. And so this work really profound and impactful, especially when you see it in the space. And so again, I had to put in my plug to please go and see these works in person at the Frye Art Museum. And then Wangechi Mutu on the right here, an artist who was in residence in the early 2000s, someone who was also actually thinking about nature and environment. This work here, Magnificent Monkey Ass Lies, Mutu investigating the sexualization of Black bodies, particularly Black female bodies, thinking about how that the power exchange between this chimeric female figure and the monkey-like figure that rises from her hand is unclear, right? But incorporating, the talons of a bird, other type of animal forms as a way to reflect on, again, our human interaction with nature and the impact of that, while also exploring these broader themes of what it means to that society, right, has imposed on Black women, right, and Black women's bodies. I'm going to try and move a bit faster. The next theme section in the show is called F shows, and this takes a bit of explanation in that it's probably not clear to most. F shows were a series of exhibitions that started at the Studio Museum in 2001. As you can imagine, they all began with the letter F. And started with an exhibition called Freestyle. And it was a way for the institution to really think through what practices were emerging by artists at a particular moment. So it's an exhibition series that really celebrates the work of emerging artists of African descent, is non-thematic, and also is not in a particular format. So we don't do it every set amount of time. It's more as a way to celebrate and gather together the work of artists at any given moment. And so these shows, there were 5 from 2001 to 2018, and they really celebrate the complexity, the multiplicity of practices that have taken place and taken shape over those years. So 2 works again, Audubon Ankanga, who was in the 3rd F show, which was called Flow, which was organized by Christine Y. Kim, that explored a notion of diaspora, a notion of how Africa as a continent has impacted the work of people who were living outside of that continent, explored the work of artists who grappled with an identity that was often multiple, that often encompassed a variety of influences. And so Nkanga, an artist who was born in Nigeria, but who lives and works in Belgium. And this work here, Houseboy, really thinking through, again, human interaction with nature, thinking about the social and topographic relationship with everyday environment. A kind of cyborg robotic-like figure, but that really calls to mind the exploitation of bodies in the domestic service industry, right? This houseboy who needs multiple arms in order to be able to do all of the chores, all of the work that is expected of him. Nkanga, someone who utilizes a variety of media, performance, obviously works on paper, to really think through kind of broader questions of what it means for us to be interacting with in a larger environment, every day, but also social, natural environments as well. And then on the right here, Shanique Smith, another multimedia artist who has used, and in this work, Black and White Floaty is using discarded materials to think through issues of waste and excess, about consumption, about how we as humans are interacting with objects and then discard them often. And so she's inviting us, asking us to think about the past lives of these textiles, predominantly textiles, asking us to think about how these objects were used in the past and how they kind of reform and how we understand them in different ways as she has transformed it into a sculpture. This work hangs from the ceiling, right? And so our interaction with it is changed by the way in which she's asked us to see it, to be in space with it. And so bringing really questions of consumption to the fore with the way that she has bundled these objects, right? When we think about how trash is bundled, right? And often also shipped outside of our shores, right? Where do these materials normally go then, right? And how does that impact the environments which they end up in, or the people that reside in those environments? And so all of these questions, again, very specific to these artist practices, but evoke a larger understanding of what it means to be not only an artist of African descent or a person of African descent existing in the world, but also just societal issues in general. And then the last exhibition section is called Their Own Harlems. This is a section that came about when I was thinking about Harlem and Jacob Lawrence. Jacob Lawrence, in an oral history interview, talked about the importance of Harlem to him. He came to Harlem as a young person and eventually ended up in Seattle. So he's probably familiar to many of you, but spent quite a number of years in Harlem and talked about how he was continually inspired by the community even long after he left it, and how he hoped people were able to find their own Harlems. Meaning Harlem is, yes, a physical site, but it's also a spiritual site. It's an emotional site. It's a place that exists where we want to find it. It's a place that we can create for ourselves. So I'm thinking about Harlem as community, as a place where people can gather physically, but also as a place where people can be as a thought process. And so this section really celebrates Harlem as a physical site, but also thinks about, again, larger idea of what it means to be in community. So these two works kind of demonstrate those two different kind of avenues of thinking about Harlem. Faith Ringgold on the left here in Echoes of Harlem. This is a quilt, if you couldn't tell from this image. It's actually the first quilt that she made, and it's the last collaborative work that Ringgold made with her mother, Willie Posey, who was a well-known tailor in Harlem. And so again, thinking about community, right, in the fact that she is creating this work as a collaborative project with her mom. And it celebrates community in general, right? We see the faces of 30 people who are all individualized in this quilt as a way to think about the many lives that Harlem has, the many people that live and work and celebrate Harlem. And what Faith Ringgold has done here is created a quilt that we think of as having a life that is different from or separate from art, right? It's something that we live with, right? Oftentimes it's something that can be passed down generation to generation. And so thinking about the actual form of the work itself as a quilt, bridges the divide that can often exist between art and life. And so this work, even though it hangs from the wall, has a deeper resonance with the ways in which we think about art. And then on the right here, Lorraine O'Grady, this work is part of a series called the Miscegenated Family Album, in which O'Grady was investigating her relationship with her sister. She had a sister, Devonia, who passed away at a younger age. And on a trip to Egypt, O'Grady realized or found kind of strikingly a relationship or a resemblance between Devonia and Nefertiti, and so embarked on a series where she's exploring through photography Devonia and Nefertiti as diptychs, or as images presented next to each other, or their relatives. And so we have here actually Devonia's sister Lorraine, the artist, on the left, and then Nefertiti's sister Nejmet on the right, as a way to think about complicated understandings of skin tone and the social implications and social realities of interracial marriage. And so O'Grady has said, the first time she came across people that had her skin tone, or the first time she realized that people existed who looked like her, was on this trip to Egypt, O'Grady growing up in the Boston area. So again, thinking about how she was able to find community for herself in Egypt, right? In a country that was not one that she had grown up in a country that she was a visitor to. And so ideas that artists are exploring across kind of different geographic divides as well. And I want to end with this work, which looks actually a bit blurry, so I apologize for that. This is Tom Lloyd's Musaku. It might be the last work that you see as you walk out of the galleries, and a fitting ending because it's where we began. This is a work that was included in the first exhibition at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 1968. We did a solo show of Tom Lloyd's work, and the exhibition was called Electronic Refractions 2. And so this exhibition, Black Refractions, is actually, the title of it is actually inspired by that first exhibition, Electronic Refractions 2. And so refraction being an idea about kind of how not only light here, as in this case, but ideas, works are refracting, right? That they're allowing for a multiplicity of narratives, allowing for different avenues of thinking through artistic practices and how that relates to larger social ideas. And so Lloyd, very important to the institution's history, as he was the first artist that we exhibited, but also important to a larger understanding of artistic production in that time in the 1960s. He was an artist who was working in time-based media at a point where artists were only beginning to do that. And also the fact that he was a Black artist doing this was pretty unique. He worked with engineers, specifically engineers at RCA, Radio Corporation of America, to create these works, which I think is really interesting to think about, right? Again, bridging that divide between art and technology, or art and, industry. And this work has flashing lights in a very specific pattern, and is the series of works that he did that utilized these sculptures were inspired by flashing traffic lights with marquees, with the city, right? The lights of the city. So someone who is really thinking through what it meant to exist in an urban environment, inspired by the city as a location. And so just in thinking again about the ties to the museum's history, Lloyd being that first artist, he was a part of the studio program, which was a program that provided financial help to create these new works, as well as young apprentices to assist in their creation. And so tying again to the institution's history and commitment to art artists of African descent, living artists, and also education as a central core component of the institution's mission. Engaging young people with the creation of artwork was a really fascinating component of this program. And so you see just two archival images here of Lloyd working with these young people in his studio in Jamaica, Queens. And you can see Musaku in both of these images kind of here in the process of being created. And so I love these works just in thinking again about how this kind of all ties into the institution's history and is really a celebration of the institution's kind of founding moments, but also, it's just always fun to see how artists engage, make the work, but also engage with young people. So the last one I just want to show is when you all have a chance in the next couple of years, please do come out to New York to see our new building and come visit us when we reopen in this beautiful building designed by Ajay Associates. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Connie. All right. Well, thank you. That was really great to have that explanation, that almost virtual walkthrough of the exhibition with you. And now we'll take some questions from our audience. Just a reminder, we are using the Q&A function rather than the chat. So take a moment to locate that option and we'll go through questions as we receive them. And maybe while we're waiting for questions to come in, I'll kick us off with one. Since the Frye is the last stop for this exhibition, have you found that you've learned anything new about any of the works or the exhibition as a whole as it's traveled around the country? And might that inform your reinstall of them in the new space?
So much. I don't even know where to begin with that. One of the beautiful things about being able to see these works at 6 different venues, and particularly thinking about, over 2.5 years really, is to see how other curators and see these works, right? I mean, I've worked with these objects for a number of years now, and I still find new things when I see these works at each of the venues, right? I love the way that the exhibition was installed at the Frye Art Museum. And I mean that like in all honesty, right? Even though I haven't been able to see it in person, because there are such beautiful pairings of works, right? There's a way in which I haven't seen Richard Hunt and Al Loving next to each other in conversation. And that the way in which it enriches my understanding of both of those objects and both of those artists is new, right? It's exciting. It's exciting to think about the ways in which these works can resonate, in their various settings, but also how people can see so many different things based on what they're coming with, how they're approaching the works, what knowledge they have. And so it's informed my understanding greatly, not only of these individual objects, but of our collection, right? I've learned a lot about the strengths of our collection. I've learned a lot about what our own collecting practices over time, what works we've acquired over the years. And also it allows me to think, has allowed me to think about how these works will live in our new building, right? I'm excited to have these works installed in our building because, one of the, I think, downsides of doing this exhibition is that it was never on site for us, right? So we've had this amazing exhibition of collection works that really celebrates the history of the Studio Museum, and it was never seen by our local audiences. And so being able to see these various iterations of the show really has broadened my understanding of how it can exist once it's back home in Harlem, which has been really special.
Yeah, I think it'll be really, really exciting to see it all kind of in place again. And that connects to one of the big questions that I'm sure you get all the time is, when do you expect the museum to reopen?
That question I cannot answer for you. We are in the middle of construction, meaning we had to first demolish our former building, and we are in the middle of a New York City block on probably the busiest street in Harlem, which is 125th Street. It's really kind of the main thoroughfare of Harlem, and we're also in the middle of the pandemic, and so we have proceeded with construction as we have been able to, based on CDC guidelines and state guidelines, et cetera. But we expect to reopen in the next couple years. Can I say that? Is that a satisfactory response?
That's fair enough.
You will just have to follow us on our various social media platforms to follow the construction process. Also, I will just say we also have a website that really talks about the new building, shows you more images of the building as designed by IJ Associates, and also has a feed of images so you can kind of watch the building go up. I mean, obviously that's not so exciting right now because we're a giant hole in the ground, but in the future, it'll be great to kind of see how the building rises from 125th Street.
Great, thank you. Another question, just talking about in reference to the Artist in Residence program that you mentioned, which is also a whole section in the exhibition. Who is your current artist in residence, or is that on hiatus?
It is not on a hiatus. We've been able to have a cohort of artists in residence this year. However, they have been working remotely, as we all have been. So they have been working from their homes or their studios that they've had. And 3 of them are in New York and 1 has been in LA this time. And so it's been an adjustment in terms of it hasn't had the same sense of physical space existing in the museum, existing in a museum space as previous iterations, obviously, of the cohorts have. Our current artists in residence are Widleen Cadet, who is a photographer, Genesis Jerez, who is a painter, Texas Isaiah, another photographer, and Jacoby Satterwhite, who is a mixed media artist who is actually in Black Refractions. And you can see Jacoby's work on view in the F shows section of the exhibition.
Great. And related to that, does the Studio Museum collect a work from each artist in residence?
We try. So that has been one of the main efforts of collecting, particularly in the last 15 or 20 years. The museum has actively acquired, when it has been able to, work by every artist in residence. And so the museum was not founded with a collection and was not founded with an endowment. And so that wasn't possible so much before the 2000s. But what we have been able to do is we've been so lucky to have such generous donors who actually have been a lot of artists who have gifted work to the museum. And so we do have a lot of early work by artists in residence, so amazingly, work that they actually created during their residency. And so you can see that in Black Refractions. The Kerry James Marshall's Silence is Golden was made during his residency at the museum in the 80s. Kehinde Wiley's Conspicuous Fraud, Preeminence, was made partly during his MFA program at Yale and then finished during his residency at the Studio Museum. And there's a number of other works like that. And if you look at the credit lines, you'll see that so many of the artists themselves have gifted those works to the museum as a way to really cement our relationship with them, right? As a way to celebrate their participation in the residency, but also it creates a strong ties between the collection and the residency program and also our exhibition history.
Thank you. And a lot of questions about how, in particular, sort of the logistics of this having traveled, and there have been different iterations at different museums. I think you spoke to a little bit, but can you share a little bit more how works are selected for each location and that decision-making process?
Yeah, I didn't talk about this, but this is one of my favorite things about this exhibition. And I think one of the unique things about this exhibition is that when we embarked on this, which is a collaboration with the American Federation of Arts, we knew from the very beginning that we did not want this show to be to present one narrative, right? Because there is no one narrative of Black artistic production, right? It was never meant to tell us a story of artistic production from the 1920s to the present, because first, our collection, the number of works in the show can't accommodate that, right? We would need a show of, thousands of objects, but also because there is no one narrative, right? And I think, and I hope that the show really shows that, right? There's a way in which you can approach every single object and from a variety of viewpoints. And so what we did, which was a way to allow venues to tailor the exhibitions to suit the needs of their own audiences, was to present options, right? And so we organize the show with two overarching thematic avenues, but also with the understanding that venues could create their own sections, right? Create their own organization of the show. And each venue decided to do something differently. And so what the Frye did, what Amanda did so brilliantly, was combine certain things, right? And so that abstraction section is actually one that Amanda created because she saw how many artists were working abstractly and wanted to point that, to really recognize that, to highlight that, because it is really an important aspect of Black artistic production, particularly in that moment of the museum's founding, which is why it comes right after the section on the founders, right? And so she was able to create that section as a way to highlight that, and also as a way to put that in kind of relationship with so many of the figurative works that are in the show, right? You see that running throughout the exhibition, that there's an emphasis on the figurative as a way to celebrate, oftentimes, the Black body, right? To present a positive representation, to counter so many of the negative representations that exist in society. And so that abstract section was her way, too, of thinking about how artists were grappling with a larger understanding of their own kind of practice within the world. And so it probably put more pressure on the venues and the venue curators, because we didn't present a set kind of packaged exhibition as I think a lot of people expect when they take on a traveling exhibition. But I hope that it also allowed each of the venues to think about what it meant for the show to be in their own space, in their own communities, right? We really wanted to be in collaboration with each of the venues because, I'm in Harlem. I don't know necessarily the Seattle audience. We wanted there to be a dialogue that existed as a way, again, just thinking about how you are building community and the work that you do, right? As a way to build community across these various audiences. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's exciting because, as mentioned in the opening, there are over 80 artists represented, and I think actually over 90 works in this particular iteration. So it's really quite expansive in that sense.
Yeah. And I guess I didn't answer part of your question in that there is a set checklist, but each of the venues were allowed to kind of select what works they wanted to show based on that set checklist. And so the overall checklist was about 100 objects. And, just given the various sizes of the gallery spaces, right, the ways in which you often have to accommodate for odd spaces. It really, just was a way for us to provide a little bit more breathing room for venues to create a show that really suited not only their audiences, but their physical spaces.
Great. A question from one of our visitors who actually got a chance to see the exhibition in person mentioned they were struck by how many pieces had religious or spiritual undertones or overtones. And can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's actually something that's interesting that I'm thinking, I'm sure you're thinking specifically about Barclay Hendricks' Lottie Mama, which is obviously the signature image of the show. It's in the catalog. It's the image that we often start with, which is also why I don't talk about it, because exactly. You see it so often everywhere. But then Betty Saar's work has a lot of spiritual undertones. I actually have not really thought about that, but it makes a lot of sense. And I think, in particular, to speak about those two artists separately, Barclay Hendricks in that work in particular, it does speak to, right, these Byzantine icons, right? It does very deliberately ask us to make that association, right, with the curved frame, the canvas, with the heavy use of gold leaf, with the halo that you see with the subject's afro, creating a halo around her head. That is a very deliberate use of religious iconography as a way to equate, right, the Black body, particularly the Black female body, with reverence, right, with a way of thinking of it as celebrating beauty. And very deliberately so, as a way to, again, counteract a lot of the negative representations that we were seeing and we still see to this day, of Black bodies in particular. And so that, I think, is a really just amazingly resonant example of how an artist is utilizing our own understandings, not just of art history, but also just of religious iconography, to imbue in us a sense of what it means to celebrate and have a sense of respect for the female form. And then Betty Saar is a different case in that, Saar has long been intrigued by mysticism, intrigued by various forms of religion, and has investigated that throughout her really decades-long career, incorporating a lot of found materials utilizing a lot of things related to mysticism and voodoo and other forms of religion as a way to think about spirituality as a whole, and as a way to think about culture as a whole too. And so her work's taking on a different tone in that they're not necessarily as direct as Hendrix's work is, but allows for kind of a broader associations while being very rooted to these core main concerns that she's, investigated for over 60 years now.
Great. Thank you for that. So we are close to time and won't be able to get to all the questions that have come up, but I would encourage everyone who's interested in learning more about the studio museums. I know there are a lot of questions specifically about the building and the design of the space. So I know that that's actually a lot of it's on the website, so you can look that up and learn more. But I do want to thank Connie today for joining us and for giving us this great conversation. And we're excited for others to see the exhibition in person if they're able to. And there will be more information on that in the chat. If anyone is able to come and see the show in person, we strongly encourage it. It really is a special experience.
Yeah.
And I want to thank everyone for joining us today.
Thank you so much. And really do go see the show.